Please note, rewards offered are subject to change or expire. To the author's knowledge, reward amounts are current and valid as of this episode's air date and may be subject to terms and conditions. Please confirm all reward details with the relevant case authority listed in the show notes. Welcome back to Reward Offered and part 2 of our dive into the death of Jason Guise over Easter 2019 in Brisbane. First up in this episode, we're going to look at the various possible scenarios for how Jason came to be inside SP33. We'll look at Coroner Mackenzie's examinations of the various motives for Jason's death. And by the end, we'll see what's left as the most likely scenario for how Easter Sunday 2019 unfolded. I'm your host Amanda. Let's dive in. If any of the details of this case cause you distress, please reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14 in Australia or a relevant crisis support service in your local area. When examining the idea of Jason being directly deposited into SP33, we need to consider how a perpetrator gained entry to the pumping station itself. While there was a section of fence in the front corner of the property found to be possibly lifted in such a way to allow a person to squeeze under, Jason was noted as having weighed over 100 kilos, and if he was dragged underneath the fence, there was still an additional distance of 10 to 15 metres to the well, of which his body would need to be dragged or carried across. Detective Dads confirmed that testing conducted by police had all but discounted this as a possible method of access to the station with the body. Okay, I'm going to give my 2 cents here. There will be stills and video like from the street view of the pumping station on our socials, so you can see what I mean when I say this about the fence. This, to me, seems like the type of fencing that, when installed, it would be pretty taut across the base, even though there's no bar across the bottom. It's just, at most, a piece of wire running along the base, leaving the edge of the chain link resting on or just above the ground. Even if there is a section that police were able to lift to such a degree that you could fit Jason under, I mean, this guy wasn't lean. You can see in the servo footage that he has a bit of a belly on him, so the fence would need to be lifted quite considerably. And I just can't see that type of fencing just springing back into place. I think the resulting distortion in the fence from lifting it in that manner would have been clearly apparent to police when they examined the fence. So I tend to agree that under the fence is out as an option of entry. With this point in the fence excluded, we're told it leaves the only access point to the site solely at the front gates and a requirement for the individual to have had a key to the padlock secured to the gate. It's noted that the padlock being utilised was a generic S100 model padlock and was a standard padlock used by most city councils. A friend who's a locksmith also indicated to me that the S100 is a high security padlock and pretty quickly shut down my query as to whether it could have been picked. So that option's out. The padlock on the well itself was also generic, but not nearly as common as the one on the gate. A later internal investigation conducted by Queensland Urban Utilities concluded that the padlock which had been on the well at the time of the discovery had rusted through, and as such, while it had been looped through the handle, it had been unable to be locked, leaving the well unsecured. Forensic examinations of the fence, padlocks, and wet well itself did not reveal any positive forensic results. So if he goes into the sewer at SP33, we know a perpetrator has to have had a key to the main gate, and I'm assuming anyone with that key would also have a key to SP33, or at minimum knew the well was unsecured at the time. Then there's the exposure. If you look at the news clips on our socials and the satellite and street views, you can see that the pumping station is located on a street corner. Anyone at that station, even after dark, would have been very visible. You'll notice that there's a light on the side of the building that was definitely present at the time of the crime in 2019. Now, I don't know if that was routinely on at night, but if it was, the area around SP33 certainly wouldn't have been in darkness. And if it wasn't on, perpetrators would have needed a torch or some other light source, perhaps even headlights from a vehicle. Either way, it would have been difficult to conceal your presence disposing of a body. Not to mention, I imagine moving a guy who weighs over 100 kilograms and is now a dead weight would not have been a quiet endeavour from the people doing the moving. Coroner Mackenzie concludes that he finds the disposal of Jason's body directly into SP33 to have been unlikely. Then where does that leave us? Supposedly the only other identified possibilities for Jason's body making its way into that wet well is his body being deposited into one of the manholes located throughout Wynnum that was connected to SP33. Coroner Mackenzie identifies that there was evidence before the court that given the amount of water pressure flowing through the sewerage system into the treatment plant wet wells, a body could in fact travel through a 900mm sewer pipe. What I haven't seen indicated is whether they believe that this water pressure could also explain the removal of Jason's clothing and a shoe. And is it odd that those items are off, but his socks are still on? Where's the second shoe? And his lower clothing? Were they found in the well too? And if they weren't, was there anywhere else for them to have gone within the system? Or should they have been found if they were with him when he went into the sewer? Back to the well. It was also noted that there was no grate that would have prevented the body from entering the wet well before it reached the pumping station. A 900mm pipe was identified as running from the pumping station along Granada Street and Fox Street. It was confirmed by Queensland Urban Utilities that neither the 900mm pipe nor the wet well itself were connected to stormwater pipes and that it would not be possible for the body to have entered the pipe at Wynnum Creek. There were also no other 900mm pipes coming off of the one that ran along Granada and Fox. 8 manholes were identified along the Granada and Fox stretch of 900mm pipe. These are their locations: 31 Adams Street, 36 Granada Street, 28 Granada Street, 12 Granada Street, the intersection of Glenora and Granada Streets, the intersection of Fox and Wild Streets, and on the footpath of Fox Street. I'll put still shots and clips of each manhole and the surrounding area from the Google Street View up on our socials. The first thing that will likely stick out to you is just how unbelievable it is that anyone would choose any of these locations to dispose of a body of this size, given how exposed you are. Even if you pull a car up to one of these, this isn't an in and out job. You need at least 2 people to move him. And on the back streets, it's not such an issue. But some of these manholes are on main streets. So if your second guy is the driver, he either has to pull up in the middle of the road and get out to help you, you need a third guy, or you have to park the car away from the manhole and drag the body to it, when a car could literally come upon you at any moment. Let's take a closer look at each of the manholes. Those at 31 Adams Street and 36 Granada Street both had circular manhole covers. It's noted that a cylindrical, vertical sensor had been installed at the opening of 36 Granada, which potentially could have impeded an attempt to insert a body. The 4 manholes at 28 Granada, 12 Granada, the cross-section of Glenora and Granada, and the cross-section of Glenora and Fox were all triangular in shape. It's suggested that this shape would have made depositing the 100 kilo plus body very difficult, and again, Jason had some decent girth around his belly, which would likely complicate the situation for a perpetrator. I think I've established that the circular holes, it's not the size of the cover, but the narrowest point in the hole in the ground, I believe is 600 mils. The triangular ones, which, from what I can tell, from what I found online, are basically old sewer caps from the 50s and 60s, and the point of the triangle basically points in the direction of the flow. Based on someone's comments in a forum that I found, I think the sides of the triangle caps are about 500 mil. That's getting real tight for a grown man's shoulders. If that's accurate, if there's no damage to the body to indicate that he was squished in, for lack of a better term, if they're 500, you can just about rule them out. Mr. Yikes. Bazudenhout was called to give evidence regarding the sewer system around the well where Jason had been located. I'm just going to call him Mr. B. Mr. B advised that the manhole located on the footpath of Fox Street actually ran along the 675mm pipeline. He couldn't say for certain whether it was possible for a body of Jason's size to travel along the smaller sized pipe under the associated water pressure, only that it would be easier for it to do so along the 900mm section. Now, one thing I believe I've mentioned in the video online is when I looked up the Queensland Urban Utilities website, you basically can look up an asset data map. It's just an open source map where you can basically see where the sewer lines run. Now, the legend that's on the side, this section of pipe that we're talking about, according to that legend, is not a pressurized line. The line is only pressurized once it gets to the pumping station. It's leaving the pumping station that it's pressurized. This whole section of line that we're talking about, these manholes along, is actually gravity fed. So when he's using the word pressure, I don't really understand what he's saying. Whether he's saying that just the pressure created by the gravity flow of the line, possibly. You would need a certain amount of water in the pipes to move him if you don't have any pressure either pushing him along or sucking him along. That sounded horrible. But another problem that I have, if it's not a pressurized line, there's at least 2 points, maybe 3, where the body has to do almost a 90-degree turn. Now, I'm not saying that they used 90-degree pipes at those intersections, but it's a hard turn, right? And if the line isn't pressurized, devil's advocate, maybe this explains why it took him so long to get there. Because I did read an article from early on that one of the detectives had stated to the paper that men were at the station every 10 to 14 days. And I don't know whether he's saying that they would clean that well out every 10 to 14 days or just that somebody was at the station itself. But if that well gets cleaned every 10 to 14 days, somebody would have seen him. He hasn't been in there that whole time. But that doesn't rule out him coming along the line though, because if it's not pressurized, that might actually make sense, that it's taken enough water flow to push him along the line gradually. Because you would have certain times I assume you have like certain times of day where more people are having showers, so you'd have more water flowing through the pipe at one time, and maybe those are flushing him down the line gradually. The manhole located over the intersection of Fox and Wild Streets had been sealed over by bitumen and was inaccessible. The remaining 7 manhole covers did not require a custom tool to open them, and it was noted that a crowbar or similar tool could have done the job. Coroner Mackenzie suggested that given all we've just mentioned, that the manhole located at 31 Adam Street is the most likely candidate for being the point of entry of Jason's body. He noted, however, that with the exception of the manhole at Fox and Wild, none of the other manholes could be conclusively excluded as the point of entry. Now, I'm not sure exactly when it was sealed over, and if council have a definitive date that they know for certain it happened, and that date was prior to April 21st, then fair enough. But this inquest occurs in 2021, and going by Google Street View, it hadn't yet been sealed over in June 2018, but had been sealed over by September 2020. It's also since been unsealed. But I'm assuming police would have investigated this whole pipe manhole scenario pretty early on, and if they did, admittedly they would have noticed immediately if it was sealed over. But there is no mention in the findings of any forensic testing being done at these other manhole entries the way it was done at SP33. You would assume that would be done though, given the hole sizes at those are much smaller than SP33, so your chance of having forensic evidence would be greater if one of those points had been used. At the conclusion of the inquest, a submission made by Rawlings was that the insertion of Jason's body directly into the wet well could not be conclusively discounted, given that, notwithstanding 3 lines of obstacle to entry, being the perimeter gate, the wet well lid, and the safety cage, the only form of ostensible security was provided via the lock on the gate to the perimeter fence. Once inside this gate, there was no further measure to prevent the disposal of the body. Coroner Mackenzie accepted this observation, but noted that there was simply no conclusive evidence as to whether a trespasser would or would not have had access to such a key, not to mention the high level of exposure to surrounding dwellings a trespasser would risk. Nevertheless, he concluded direct disposal into SP33 had to remain on the table, despite the unlikelihood. I will mention that it's not super clear, but the coroner's notes on some submissions from Rawlings about Mr. B's opinions seemed to indicate that the sewer expert concluded that he didn't believe that Jason could have been dumped through a manhole. But Mr. B having held this position isn't explicitly mentioned in the findings from what I can see, only Rawlings' objection to it. And I'm mentioning this because I think it's important to know how much weight we're supposed to be giving everything we're considering, right? And in response to Rawlings' critique that Mr. B's stance required him to make a number of assumptions in order to arrive at his conclusions, the coroner writes, quote, "With respect, the engineer's evidence was only speculative on these points. the overall evidence regarding the sewers at Wynnum was generally unsatisfactory and conclusive. I'm not sure if that's a typo. I think maybe it's meant to read unsatisfactory and inconclusive, because conclusive doesn't make much sense to me given the context. So yeah, ultimately Coroner Mackenzie lands on neither direct disposal into SP33 or via a manhole as more probable, but rather just as probable as the other given the evidence. While it was unclear how Jason's body came to be present in the sewer well, there was a consensus that suicide or accidental death by means of entering the well should be excluded by virtue of the difficulties one would have in replacing the manhole cover above themselves from the inside. One other factor that seems to me to conclusively exclude this, that the coroner doesn't identify, is the fact that it's described that the two lockable handles on the SP33 cover were closed over the lid. So even if Jason could have managed to replace the lid, he certainly couldn't have turned the handles into the lock position from within. With suicide out, the coroner lists 5 apparent scenarios, seemingly consistent with the available evidence in the case as still on the table. 1. Jason became involved in a drug-fueled argument with associates which led to his death from an assault. 2. Jason committed suicide, died of natural causes, or accidentally overdosed on an illicit drug, presumably methamphetamine, and his body was deposited into the sewer by others anxious to avoid police scrutiny. 3. Jason was engaged in serious criminal activity involving the recovery of firearms, cash, and drugs from interstate and was killed possibly to cause his silence. 4. Jason was killed in retribution for unpaid drug debts or on suspicion of informing police about a drug dealer. And 5. Jason was killed by an associate of Miss Rachel Thea Harudis as retribution for his acts of domestic violence against her in the past. Coroner Mackenzie does note that the 2 truly independent and uncontroversial bodies of evidence in the investigation were 1. The potentially toxic level of methamphetamine in Jason's post-mortem liver samples, and 2. The conclusive opinion of experts that Jason could not have entered sewer well SP33 alone and replaced the manhole cover over himself. Let's examine each of the 5 scenarios. First up, that Jason was killed after a drug-fueled argument. We know that Johnson is experiencing paranoia on the day in question, and again, without knowing definitively whether Jason was killed at some point on Sunday night into early Monday morning, or at a later point, we can't rule him out with what we have. We also have Rachel, who spoke of Jason's propensity for violence whenever he was using ice, and while there is uncertainty as to just what his antemortem levels were, we know that methamphetamine was found in Jason's system, so he may have been prone to engaging in conflict prior to his death. You can also see in the footage of him filling up Johnson's Commodore that while he's moving about quite normally most of the time, he does stumble at least twice in the footage. Once as he exits the car after pulling up to the Bowser, and again after he finishes closing the fuel cap and turns to head towards the station. Well, actually, he's heading towards Coles. Admittedly, this is much earlier in the day, but he's evidently impaired and possibly agitated given his using. So who could Jason have conflict with? Belinda Schwartz recalled a conversation she'd had with Jason that she says occurred in the days leading up to his disappearance, where he indicated that he was concerned about his welfare. There's no further information, though. There was reportedly also evidence of a possible ultimatum from Kelly for Jason to leave their residence. Jason was actively maintaining relationships with former fellow inmates, and there was evidence he was angered by the theft of his belongings while he was incarcerated. Any of these situations could have resulted in confrontations for Jason. It's also noted that being a long-term intravenous drug user, Jason would likely have been susceptible to heart failure during a highly stressful event. Coroner Mackenzie points to Kelly's curious behaviour in the aftermath of Jason's disappearance and Johnson's paranoid antics on Sunday evening as reasons for suspicion of the involvement of each man respectively. One thing the coroner does mention is that both men deny any interactions with Jason after 6:45 that night. And remember that, we'll come back to it shortly. Our next option to look at is that Jason committed suicide, died of natural causes, or accidentally overdosed, presumably on methamphetamine, and that his body was put in the sewer by others to avoid police scrutiny. It's evident that Jason had a methamphetamine addiction and was a regular user with a high tolerance. He was part of the illegal drug scene in Wynnum, and those known to him said that he would purchase the drug from various suppliers in the area in whatever amount he could afford at the time, though evidence seems to suggest that he was most commonly doing 1 gram purchases of late. Long-term drug addiction can lead to a variety of medical conditions, particularly cardiac arrhythmia. It's also not uncommon for prisoners with high usage levels pre-incarceration to overdose after a period of abstinence, such as one forced upon them through a term of imprisonment. Jason had only just been released on the 7th of March, and the coroner notes that it's possible a lowered tolerance for the high doses he had been known to use pre-custody could have led to an overdose. He also says there was no evidence of any suicidal ideations from Jason, but does note that methamphetamine can dramatically alter an individual's mood. Now, I agree the OD is entirely possible, but I guess I would have thought that given his regular usage, that if that was going to happen, I would have expected it to happen closer to the point of his release, not over a month later when his tolerance would have been building again. But it's of course always a possibility that a drug user overdosed. So we can't exclude this option, though I find it unlikely. If genuinely just an overdose, I can't see any of his associates going to the trouble of hiding his body, especially in this manner. I see so much trouble and risk undertaken. Regardless of whether that's depositing him into the sewer via SP33 or via a manhole situated on a public street. To me, this seems more likely to be behaviour of someone who knows they can be tied to Jason and what happened to him. There's also the whole, putting him in shit. Like, literally. They didn't put him into a stormwater drain. They put him into the sewer. So I don't know whether there's anything. Is that meant to be indicative? Is it a message? Like, is it an extra screw you to him? I don't know. It's at least possible. Now, devil's advocate, it's quite possibly erroneous to try and rationalise what drug addicts might do in the aftermath of murder to cover it up. But as absurd as those two options seem to me to hide a murder, if it was a genuine OD, they could have just put him into Wynnum Creek under the dark of night. Hell, they could have just dumped him on the side of the road. The OD would have been determined and that would have been it. This just isn't a very plausible scenario in my book. Possible, but not probable. Next option up. Jason was involved in criminal activity involving recovery of firearms, cash, and drugs from interstate and was killed to silence him. It's noted that this scenario is almost entirely based on the story from Mr. Hines. The only support for his evidence listed was that he swore under oath to his statements and had supposedly provided samples of the coded letters. And actually, that doesn't align with his story because he claimed he would destroy them after reading them, so who knows. In any case, we have nothing else to consider under this option. Once again, possible, but not probable. Was Jason killed in retribution for unpaid drug debts, supplying bad drugs, stealing from a drug dealer, or on suspicion of being a police informant? Jason was evidently deeply immersed in the local drug scene in Wynnum, and it would not be surprising if he had met with foul play that it was connected to his drug affiliations. However, the coroner says that while this scenario can't be ignored, there's also no evidence to support it. Police weren't able to uncover any evidence of any outstanding debts held by Jason, nor was he a police informant. But I don't know that I necessarily agree with the coroner's assessment here that there's zero evidence to support this option. We have Belinda Schwartz saying that she had a conversation with Jason in the days leading up to his death, whereby he indicated he was concerned about his welfare. We have Teresa Golding indicating Jason had told her that he was going on a boot ride, either on that Sunday in question or in the very least on that weekend. And we have Chantel Newbury saying that she had a phone conversation with him where Jason reportedly says, "I'm fucked, it's fucked, everything's fucked," and that he had shit to get sorted. Those all sound to me like a guy that knows someone ain't happy with him. And granted, it could be drug-induced paranoia, but he does end up dead that weekend. So maybe it wasn't. An unsubstantiated rumour mentioned at the inquest was that Jason had raped a woman by the name of Ellen Beard, and that she, Johnson, and a woman by the name of Hayley Godfrey had murdered him in retribution for the act. This seems to have been quickly excluded by police though, as Beard reportedly told them that she'd only met Jason once when he was looking to source drugs from her, and that was the extent of her interactions with him. The coroner notes no further evidence had been found to support this theory. Rachel had theorised Jason had stolen something from the wrong person and was murdered as a result of this. Although this, along with Newbury's theory that a dealer had supplied Jason with heroin instead of methamphetamine, causing him to OD, were both found to have no supporting evidence. While not indicated if it was confirmed, Kelly gave evidence that Jason had posted an aggressive message on Facebook saying, "I'm coming for you," but there's no more context provided around that, including who it was directed to. Given Jason had also just spent 12 months in custody, it's also possible he could have upset someone on the inside that we're just unaware of. Our last scenario to consider is that Jason was killed by an associate of Rachel's as retribution for the domestic violence offences committed against her. Coroner Mackenzie notes that given Jason had assaulted Rachel in the manner previously described, and given he'd spent 12 months incarcerated as a result of the charges stemming from such, there is every reason to believe that animosity would have existed between the two upon his release. But inevitably this is another scenario whereby the story seems plausible and can't be excluded, but whereby there's no evidence to support the theory, and the coroner clarifies that there is certainly no evidence of Rachel being involved in any such criminal activity. Coroner Mackenzie states that the absence of any other compelling evidence has resulted in wild speculation and conspiracy theories in the case, but finds it impossible to accept any one scenario over another, as he finds each is potentially consistent with the evidence in establishing Jason's cause of death. The inquest closed with Coroner Mackenzie only being able to identify the deceased as Jason Barry Guise and that he had died on an unknown date sometime between the 20th of April and the 9th of May 2019. How he died, where he died, and his cause of death were all unable to be established on the available evidence. He stated, quote, "It is impossible to make any substantial factual findings because the circumstances of this death are not well enough known. Obviously, the deceased is dead. However, I draw the inference that, from all the evidence, those present with Mr. Guise at around 18:30 hours on the 21st of April 2019 at the 7-Eleven store, corner of Edith Street and Tingle Road, Wynnum, remain persons of interest in this suspicious death." So where does this leave us at the end? Obviously, given Jason's victimology, he's at a higher risk for being a victim of violent crime, not just from the drug usage, but from the criminal history and the company he keeps. The problem with Johnson as a suspect is that, for him to be involved in the death of Jason, or even present at the time, the death has to have occurred after the early morning hours of Monday the 22nd of April. Because if the official narrative is correct, he has a CCTV alibi up until 2 a.m. Monday. Yet, regardless of involvement, we reportedly have multiple people claiming that he at minimum has knowledge of what happened to Jason. There is an arguably cause to be suspicious of Kelly. Rawlings submitted that Kelly's evidence painted a high suspicion of involvement in Jason's death. He posited that Kelly's explanation for the delay in reporting his housemate as a missing person remained inadequate, questioned Kelly's attempt to seemingly minimise his relationship to Jason despite their electronically recorded exchange in prison that they loved each other, and is reported to have pointed out various additional inconsistencies and contradictions which the coroner doesn't include in his findings. Rawlings suggested that Kelly had intentionally obfuscated his knowledge and conduct in relation to Jason's death, pointing to an email exchange between Johnson and Kelly as damning. At 8:57 p.m. on the 23rd of April 2019, Johnson emailed Kelly, asking, "Have you heard from Jason, bro?" A little over 2 hours later, at 11:11 p.m., Kelly replies, "Nah, still haven't. Have a feeling but not sure way things were left here." The findings suggest that the cell phone tower data is consistent with this messaging having been sent from the Bride Street unit complex in Wynnum. In my opinion, this is likely Kelly inadvertently acknowledging Jason's belongings, the bum bag, wallet, etc., having been present in the apartment on the 23rd, though he tells police he doesn't find them until May 1st. Kelly saying, "Nah, still haven't," also implies that him and Johnson have already had a prior conversation about Jason being MIA. Rawlings suggested there had been differences between Kelly's behaviour when trying to contact Jason prior to his disappearance and that which he exhibited after. He noted that in the 4 weeks leading up to Jason going missing, many times when Kelly would attempt to reach Jason and the call went unanswered, there would be 2 or 3 attempted calls, followed by a text message. However, after Jason's disappearance, no messages are ever sent to Jason's mobile. He further claims that for such a prolific phone user as Kelly, there are uncharacteristic periods of inactivity on his mobile phone on the 21st of April, particularly between the times of 7:09 p.m. and 8:04 p.m. He also points out that many of the lines of inquiry regarding other individuals and their possible motives or lack thereof for harming Jason stem solely from Kelly. These include the suggestion of animosity between Raymond Gibson and Jason before his disappearance, the suggestion that there was a disagreement between Johnson and Jason at the 7-Eleven on the 21st of April, the suggestion that Jason was the individual who had placed the food from Rosie's outside at the front of the unit and the bicycle at the base of the rear stairs, neither of which is supported by statements from the two officers that attended the unit to conduct the welfare check that night. These discrepancies influence the timeline of when Jason was purportedly present at the unit. The suggestion that there was no animosity between the two housemates, Kelly and Jason, and finally, the suggestion that Elwell exhibited aggression the day Kelly was departing for Jason's funeral. Mr. Rawlings attempted to have Kelly recalled for further cross-examination, suggesting he had a case to answer for in relation to the death of Jason, but this was declined by Coroner Mackenzie, who stated that he didn't believe that further examination of Kelly would advance their knowledge as to the circumstances surrounding Jason's death. The coroner found insufficient evidence to consider Kelly's behaviour as anything beyond suspicious. But there's still things that haven't been explained. Remember the coroner mentions that both Kelly and Johnson deny any interactions with Jason after 6:45 that Sunday night. If that statement is accurate, it means we have to be missing crucial points in the timeline that's given to us. And here's why. Let's do a quick recap. 5:50 p.m. Jason drives Johnson's red Commodore back into the same 7-Eleven from earlier in the day and parks on the western side. 6:27 p.m. Johnson uses Jason's phone to call 000. This is the call that's disconnected before an operator answers, they call back, no one answers, and this is the call that ends up resulting in the welfare check at Jason's unit later. Anyway, remember Johnson says that Jason left the 7-Eleven to avoid police. And while we can't confirm exactly why he left, we know he did, because at 6:38 p.m, Jason is seen walking through the Woolworths car park carrying a mobile phone, presumably his. 6:41 p.m. Kelly is dropped off at the 7-Eleven by the white Ford Ranger. Johnson supposedly tells Kelly that Jason had just left him there at the 7-Eleven. Now, based on that information from the coroner's findings, Jason was walking through that car park at 6:38 p.m, but Kelly hadn't yet arrived at the 7-Eleven, which is confirmed by the evidence of Johnson apparently telling Kelly that Jason had just left him there. So if both men claim to have last seen him about 6:45, then two things have to have happened that aren't mentioned anywhere in the official story. 1. Jason has to have returned to the 7-Eleven before going on to Rosie's. And 2. Kelly has to have still been present when Jason returns. Both of these have to have occurred for Jason and Kelly to even cross paths, and for that to be when Kelly last sees him. The coroner doesn't mention Jason going back. At this point, I realised that for no apparent reason, my mind had been doing that thing where it was just filling in blanks. My head had created the narrative that that car park footage was video of Jason walking back towards 7-Eleven, which would allow him to see Kelly. But from the satellite images, Jason is clearly walking away from the 7-Eleven towards Charlotte Street. I don't think Kelly saw Jason at 7-Eleven that night. And based on the information we have, the last time he saw Jason couldn't have been at any point between 5:50 that afternoon and 6:45 that night. So it was either before that time window or after. If it was before, why would he be making out that he'd seen him later in the day than what he had? And if it was after, why hasn't he disclosed where and when that was? And with this in mind, it would be interesting to know at what time the 7-Eleven cameras indicate Kelly leaves and how. Did he set off on foot alone? And if so, in what direction? Or does a vehicle pick him up? And who else is in that car? Despite Johnson's alibi, it would still be interesting to know why it was that Jason had walked off. The way Johnson frames it at least suggests that there could have been some sort of disagreement between the men. Johnson doesn't tell Kelly that it was to avoid the police, or that Jason had just headed home, or that he'd gone to Rosie's to grab some food. He makes it seem like he's been abandoned, which if Jason stormed off unexpectedly, he has been. He can't drive, remember. He needed Jason. It at least seems that he was stuck at the 7-Eleven until the two women turn up around 1 a.m. and drive his car. Although, devil's advocate, we have no idea if Kelly could have driven the car, nor any indication when Kelly leaves the 7-Eleven or where his phone shows that he went. One thing not mentioned on the timeline, but that given the information we have has to almost certainly have occurred, is Jason has to have gone home before he disappears. How do we know that? Because after leaving the food van, he's seen with his bike and wearing a helmet, neither of which were mentioned as being present with him in the 7-Eleven footage. Remember, he drove there. He also doesn't have them in the car park footage, so he had to stop and collect his bike and helmet from another location. Now, admittedly, he could have picked them up from anywhere, maybe even Johnson's if he'd ridden there and then left them there when he drove the car. But the description of Jason on the CCTV in Berrima Street describes him as carrying a plastic bag and pushing his bike. They say he's wearing a helmet, blue t-shirt, black shorts, and running shoes. But compare this to the CCTV from just 40 minutes earlier in the car park, and in fact the CCTV footage earlier that day from the 7-Eleven too. In that footage, Jason is wearing a tan cap, a white Live Fit t-shirt, black shorts and runners, with a side bag over his shoulder. And aside from the different coloured shirt, there is also no mention of the side bag in any of the CCTV footage post-car park. He still could have gotten the bike elsewhere, but with the shirt change and with the bum bag later being found in his unit, it makes me think that at some point after walking through that car park, but before he disappears, he goes home, drops off the side bag, changes his shirt, and grabs his bike and helmet. Outside of that, and again, perhaps trying to impose rationality onto someone under the influence of meth isn't the smartest move, but I think the most likely series of events probably looks something like this. Jason leaves 7-Eleven, cutting through the Woolworths car park to Charlotte Street. The Rosie's food van doesn't open for another 22 minutes though, so he ducks home. The walk back to his unit from the car park is about 8 minutes. Once he changes and collects his bike, it's just a 2-minute ride back to the corner of Tingle and Charlotte Streets, where Rosie's van is supposedly located. I don't doubt that on the 7:07 call to Kelly, that Jason probably told him that he was at Rosie's, but Kelly probably also told Jason where he was. I think Jason leaves the van with the food and heads west along Tingle until he gets to Berrima and turns right. While not explicitly clear, wording seems to support that Jason is coming along Berrima from this direction. I think the 1-minute stop off at Elwell's is likely a drug deal. He gets done with that and sets off on his bike continuing east on Berrima until he gets to the next crossroad, which is Bay Terrace. He turns right, and we're told this is the last time Jason is independently sighted. If the timeline is accurate and Jason leaves Elwell's at about 7:22 p.m. riding his bike, he can be home by 7:25. But given it's only 27 minutes later that the police arrive at Jason's unit to perform the welfare check and describe the property as being in complete darkness, with no indications of an altercation, no sign of the food on the seat out the front of the unit, no bicycle, and seemingly no neighbours having reported a ruckus, I don't think Jason went home. It's hard to say where he went. If Kelly has left 7-Eleven by now, I think there's a good chance he went wherever Kelly was, and that could explain why Kelly's involvement in the case seems so suspicious. Whether he was involved in the death or not, I think it's likely he knows who was, or at bare minimum, has a good suspicion. Because even if Jason wasn't headed to meet up with Kelly when they spoke at 7:07, I think it's more likely than not that Jason would have told Kelly what his plans were. So Kelly would have had an idea who Jason was planning on seeing. There's also indications from his email with Johnson on the 23rd that Kelly knew something, and knew that Jason's belongings were in fact in the house at that stage, 8 days before the point where he tells police he had come across them. And if Rawlings is correct, Kelly never sends another text to Jason's phone after he goes MIA. The window between Jason being last seen on CCTV at 7:22 and his phone being last recorded at 7:46 in the vicinity of Waterloo Esplanade is 24 minutes. And I think whatever happened to him happened in that window. So what about SP33? I've been in touch with Queensland Urban Utilities, and shout out to Liam for his assistance chasing down departments with my curious query trying to establish what the maintenance schedule of SP33 was in April and May of 2019. This information, in my opinion, is crucial when narrowing down our scenarios in the case. Remember, I mentioned one early article by Tracy Ferrier in the Australian Associated Press that attributes a Detective Inspector Owen Eloy as having indicated that the pumping station was visited by maintenance crews every 10 to 14 days. We need to know if this was the case, that someone was in fact inside that wet well every 10 to 14 days. How does this help us? Well, Jason goes missing on April 21st, but isn't found until May 8th. That's 18 days later. We have no reason to believe that he's alive beyond the 21st or early on the 22nd. So for our purposes, we're going to assume he isn't held somewhere for days on end and that he does indeed die on the evening of the 21st. Now we hit a couple of if this then that options. If, for any reason, whether it wasn't in fact part of the maintenance schedule or just wasn't done, and no worker had cause to inspect inside SP33 between the 21st of April and the 8th of May, then it's possible Jason was directly deposited into the wet well or one of the manholes. But if maintenance work was done on SP33 on a 10 to 14 day schedule and somebody was inside that wet well between the 26th of April and the 30th of April per that schedule, then Jason was not placed directly into the well after his death on the 21st because that worker would have seen him. This doesn't rule out direct deposit into one of the manholes though. When considering the manhole options, Coroner Mackenzie and I diverge in our perceptions of the evidence. I can see why he finds 31 Adam the most likely location, and again, if no workers are in the well between the 21st and the 8th, then I agree that 31 Adam is the most likely opening. It doesn't require a key to the padlock, there's relatively low exposure, the circular manholes would be much easier for insertion, and it doesn't require the body to traverse an extensive length of sewer pipe, nor navigate any of the turns. It only has to travel across the road. But if workers were inside before the 8th, particularly if it was closer to the 21st, then I don't agree that 31 Adam is the most likely entry. Because if the workers are on site on the 26th or earlier, I can't see it taking the body 5 days to move the 40 metres across the road. Although, devil's advocate, that is impossible to ascertain for certain without knowing what the average and peak flow of water through the pipes was. Personally, I also rule out 36 Granada for the same reasons. Not only was there the sensor that had been installed inside the cover that police say would have complicated things, it's still only about 140 metres of pipe to the wet well. With the information I have, I also rule out all of the triangular manholes. All of them because of the size, and some of them also because of the location. Anything from the Glenora and Granada intersection onward along Fox that's a triangle, I also rule out because of exposure. There's just so little control over the view of passing traffic to be wasting time battling with getting him into the triangular manholes. After everything I've read, I actually think that it's the manhole on the footpath of Fox that the coroner rules out that's the most likely manhole entry point, if it was in fact a manhole he was put into. For a few reasons. A, it's a circular cover, so you have a minimum 600mm of diameter to work with. Plenty of room. B, if workers have been in the wet well between the 21st and the 8th and they haven't yet seen him, the extra distance could explain why he hasn't made it to the wet well yet, even if he went in on the 21st. Remember, the sewer line isn't pressurised, it's gravity fed, so it makes sense to me that his body would only move along the line at the times of day when adequate consumer water usage would result in enough wastewater moving through the pipes to move him. Mr. B wasn't certain that the body could move along the 675mm pipe, but despite not being able to rule it out, this seems to be the reason that Coroner Mackenzie excluded it. But I don't know that we can exclude it that easily. This isn't just a water pipe. If it was, I could see that the friction between the pipe and the skin of the body, remember it seems that half of Jason isn't clothed, could prevent the body from moving along the pipeline. But this is wastewater. Even aside from the bodily excretions lubricating the inside of the pipe, you've got plenty of other elements to assist that are entering the pipe along with the wastewater, like dishwashing liquid, soaps, shampoos and conditioner, plus laundry chemicals. Surely all of these would be aiding and lubricating friction between the body and the pipe. Of all the manholes, this location also makes the most sense to me narrative-wise. As you'll be able to see more clearly in the video on our socials, I can totally see someone driving over the bridge and pulling up on the left in the parking spaces with the intent of putting the body over into the waterway. Yet instead, getting out of the car onto the footpath and looking down and thinking, I wonder if these things open, realising that they can in fact open the manhole cover and deciding that a hidden body is better than one out in the open. I can then see it being plausible that if workers were inside that well between the 26th and the 30th of April, the distance the body had to travel under gravity feed and intermittent water flow might explain why it hadn't yet made its way into SP33, despite Jason most likely being deposited on the 21st. And yet, if we could confirm that no one was inside that well before the 8th, I would definitely side with Mr. B, and SP33 being the deposit site over one of the manholes. If we can't rule out SP33, I don't find Jason being dumped into one of those manholes, no matter the time of night, as being more probable than someone who was involved in his death having a council key that opened one of the 5 double gates located around the perimeter of the pumping station. If the padlock is as common as Coroner Mackenzie implies, any number of council workers, including subcontractors, have those keys. Add in the complications of Jason's size and weight, the sewer line not being pressurised, the unknown rate of flow, the turns in the pipeline, and the exposure of the manhole covers. I'm by no means ruling them out, but Occam's razor? I think it's more likely someone just had a key. Although I will mention that in that same article previously mentioned, Detective Inspector Eloy, with respect to the pumping station, is also quoted as having said, "It's nowhere near as secure as you're obviously thinking. Certainly the gates aren't overly secure." So who knows what the security state of the station actually was? And despite being rather exposed, if you look at the station's location, there actually isn't a whole lot around. And despite Adam Street curving around at the waterfront to become Wynnum North Esplanade, there's nothing along the waterfront there apart from houses. It doesn't join to the main esplanade further south, so it would be local traffic only east on Adam past Granada. Far less threat of traffic than a through road. And it turns out someone didn't have to be overly exposed entering the station. If you look at the satellite and street views, you can see a dirt road that runs along the northern side of the building, up to one of the double gates located around the fence line. This gate accesses an undercover area at the back of the building, where you could easily park your vehicle largely out of sight while you worked. Yes, you would still need at least 2 people to move the body to the well, but you need that in any scenario. As best I can tell, in 2019, there was quite heavy foliage along the Adam Street side of the station's fence line, and the house directly opposite also had a large tree across the front of the house. But between the foliage cover and the location in the undercover area at the back of the building, a vehicle parked there would be hidden from line of sight of that house, as well as the one on the corner of Adam and Granada that overlooked the well. Again, when I'm trying to work out what's more likely to me, is it more likely that someone had a key and those in houses with minimal direct line of sight saw nothing? Or is it more likely that the perpetrators pulled a car up on a suburban street with half a dozen houses with line of sight, or on a main thoroughfare where anyone could drive past at any moment, opened up a public manhole cover with a crowbar or similar instrument, manhandled a 100-plus kilo man into the hole in full public view, replaced the cover, and no one saw a thing? Regardless, I'll let you know on our socials if I find out about the maintenance schedule and if we can narrow this down any further as a result. Included in the findings is a statement from the coroner that is kind of a throwaway. He briefly, and by briefly I mean one sentence, mentions a telecommunications expert by the name of Mark Borg, saying that Borg was of the opinion that activity on Jason's mobile after 7:46 p.m. must be treated as an anomaly, but we're given no more information on that. So it sounds like some other stuff is going on with Jason's phone that we're just not privy to, along with the rest of it. Now, obviously cell data, I've been listening to way too many American cases, mobile data, from all the individuals at the centre of this case, no doubt paints a more detailed picture than what we can see with what we have. And I think police probably have a pretty good idea about who was physically with Jason in the crucial time window after 7:22 based on that data. But obviously the data itself doesn't tell you what's happening. And whether intended or not, the disposal method used ended up likely destroying a lot of physical evidence that might have helped fill in those gaps. We don't even have a cause of death. Instead, we're left with this patchy at best, circumstantial narrative. I don't think Jason's case being unsolved is because the crime was particularly criminally sophisticated. I think it's more likely it's just dumb luck that no one saw them disposing of Jason's body, regardless of whether that was done at the station or on the street. They were one eyeball away from coming undone, and even now, they're just one nervous accomplice away from it. One of the last comments made by Coroner Mackenzie in his findings was, quote, "Should further relevant evidence become available, there will always be an opportunity to reopen this inquest," unquote. I'd say it's likely that the only way that can ever happen is if someone comes forward with additional information. Much like the case of Mark Russell that we looked at from New South Wales, a difficulty of these cases is the possibly unscrupulous nature of those who are privy to the very information police need to solve the case. Jason's death is the most recent occurring case I've covered so far. We know that the longer a case remains unsolved, the less likely it becomes that it ever will be, for any number of reasons. The only real benefit of older cases is the chance for relationships between individuals involved in the crime or privy to relevant information to have changed. That's why I think rewards in cases, particularly these types of cases, can be so beneficial when they're newer. When deciding whether or not to come forward with information, the people that run in circles such as those in this case have considerations unique from those in other types of cases. A sum of money, particularly of these amounts, offers an opportunity to remove themselves from the area should they be concerned about retribution. These aren't just rewards for information. These are life-changing sums of money. At the time of his death, Jason Guise was just 45 years old and is survived by 3 children. Regardless of anything he may have done or struggles he may have faced with addiction, this is not a just end to his life. He had family and friends who loved him and who were very much victims of this crime too. There is a $250,000 reward offered for information in the death of Jason Guise and an indemnity from prosecution on the table for any accomplice who is not the individual who took his life. If you have any information regarding Jason's death, please call Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000. You can remain entirely anonymous and still claim the reward. You have zero downside to coming forward. Get paid, change your life, ease your conscience, and give Jason's family answers. That's it for this one, kids. Socials are reward_offered. If you'd like to support the caffeine addiction required to cover these cases in such detail, you will find a Patreon link in the description. Shout out to Nick Brack for the 5-star review on Apple. If you're a Spotify listener, you can now leave comments on episodes in the app or text us via the link in the description, apparently. If you have any case suggestions or anything else to say, shoot us an email at rewardofferedpod@gmail.com. I wanted to say a quick thank you to those of you who shared Angela Mealing's episodes. The reach on her case has been absolutely incredible. I'm honoured to tell these victims' stories, but I'd be lying if I said that the underlying goal wasn't always to shake something loose that results in a case being solved. Keep sharing, keep talking. It's a hefty goal, no doubt. But podcasts and their listeners have helped solve cases. And if they can do it, we can too. Catch you on the next dive. Thanks for listening.